A committee of philosophers once handed a young man a verdict he never forgot. His ideas, they wrote, had not been tested in the crucible of direct moral experience. He was in his 20s, at the top of his field, and he thought it was the most pompous sentence he had ever read. He repeated it to friends. He laughed about it for years. Then life tested him. A pain arrived at 27 that no doctor could name. A mother's mind began to go. Kieran Setiya is a professor of philosophy at MIT, and the book he finally wrote is not a manual for a happier life. It is an argument that the entire tradition he was trained in has been quietly lying to us about what a good life even is. And it ends by dismantling the most hopeful line ever written about hope. It opens on a scene Ludwig Wittgenstein once described to his sister. "You remind me of someone," he told her, "who is looking through a closed window and cannot explain to himself the strange movements of a passerby. He does not know what storm is raging out there, or that this person might only with difficulty be keeping himself on his feet." That image carries the whole book. From inside, behind glass, the figure out in the weather looks clumsy, ridiculous even. You cannot hear the wind. Hardship, Setiya writes, is routinely hidden, and the hiding is not accidental. We are trained to hide it, and trained not to look for it. So the first question is not how to fix a hard life. It is why we agreed, collectively, to pretend we could not see one. He is careful to say he has been lucky. A childhood in Hull, a Cambridge education, a job at MIT, a marriage of 25 years. But at 27, a pain arrived in his body and never left. At 35, he had what he calls a premature midlife crisis, and 8 years before he wrote this book, his mother was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. "I am grieving," he writes, "for someone who is still alive." That sentence is the hinge. Grief is supposed to arrive after a death. The way a receipt arrives after a purchase, his does not. It turns up while she is still in the room. And once you notice that grief refuses to obey its own rules, you start wondering what else about suffering you were taught wrong. Here is what he thinks moral philosophy did. For 2,500 years, it theorized the good life and repressed the bad one. Aristotle described a flourishing existence lacking in nothing, and instructed us to make ourselves immortal as far as we can. Even the Stoics, the philosophers built explicitly for adversity, came out surprisingly upbeat, insisting we can flourish in any circumstance, that well-being is entirely up to us. The philosopher Shelley Kagan had to coin a word, ill-being, because the field owned no working vocabulary for going badly. Setiya's response is one blunt sentence. A premise of this book is that this whole approach is wrong. We should not turn away from hardship, and the best is often out of reach. Striving for it only brings dismay. Denial wears a friendly face. When you tell someone your life has come apart and they say, "Do not worry, it will all be fine," they are not consoling you. They are declining to acknowledge you. Assurance and advice, Setiya writes, can operate as denial. The grander version is theodicy. Everything happens for a reason, except, of course, it does not. In the book of Job, the divine verdict at the end is not that Job's friends were unhelpful. It is that they were wrong, and they are condemned for it. And the story's ending, replacement children handed over as though a child were a component, is a travesty. The trouble with justifying suffering is not that it fails intellectually. It is that it is a moral failure, performed on someone already flat on the floor. So start with the body. Pittsburgh, a cinema called The Oaks. A stabbing pain arrives out of nowhere, and Setiya spends that night on the bathroom floor. The tests come back negative. There are studies, procedures, a hospital that forgets he is still there afterward, and a walk home down Forbes Avenue, quietly bleeding. The third urologist tells him to try to ignore it if you can. 13 years pass without a diagnosis. Meanwhile, his family keeps its own ledger. His mother-in-law with stage 3 ovarian cancer, his wife's surgery, his father-in-law's open-heart operation, his mother. The question a philosopher is trained to ask is what an ideal life would look like. The question this family actually has is different. How should we live with the malfunctioning bodies we have? Philosophy of medicine draws a line here that changes everything. Disease is a biological malfunction. Illness is what that malfunction does to a life. The second does not follow automatically from the first, which means illness is distributed even more unequally than disease is. disability scholars push harder. Rosemary Garland Thompson moves disability out of medicine and into the politics of minorities. Elizabeth Barnes writes that to be physically disabled is not to have a defective body, but simply to have a minority body. Setiya reaches for the Taoist farmer whose horse runs away. "Such bad luck," say the neighbors. "Maybe," says the farmer. And then the survey evidence says the thing the healthy find almost impossible to believe. People who acquire a disability typically do not suffer much lasting reduction in the enjoyment of life, which wrecks Aristotle. His best life is lacking in nothing and organized monomaniacally around contemplation, and modern self-help has sanded that down and to develop your strengths, realize your potential, getting him precisely backwards. Setiya's counterlist is deliberately unruly. Martin Luther King and Iris Murdoch. The baseball owner, Bill Veeck, a Cambridge philosopher. Rabbi Hillel. Marie Curie. No single shape between them. Then he tests the limit with Melville's clerk, Bartleby, who answers every request with "I would prefer not to," and refuses his way out of his own life. Not every preference is equal, so Bartleby is a warning rather than a model. But between him and Aristotle sits the truth. A good life is selective, limited, fractional. It leaves things out. And what it leaves out does not make it worse. Take Bill Veeck. He started as a popcorn vendor and ended up owning 3 major league clubs. He integrated the American League. He invented the exploding scoreboard. He won a pennant in 1948 and another in 1959. All of it after a war injury took his right foot and much of his leg. Then take Harriet McBride Johnson, born with a neuromuscular disease, who protested the Jerry Lewis telethon, ran for county council, and traveled to debate the philosopher who argued parents should be permitted to end the lives of infants born as she was. Asked whether disabled people are worse off, she answered, "I do not think so. Not in any meaningful sense. There are too many variables. Neither life is lacking in nothing. Both are unmistakably good." But Setiya refuses to let this become an inspirational story because his own body would not cooperate. There were more studies, one of which made him faint mid-procedure. There was a surgery he declined. There were rounds of antibiotics for an infection nobody could find. And then the 5th urologist did 2 things. He gave the condition a name, chronic pelvic pain, which means exactly what it sounds like and explains nothing at all. And he took Setiya seriously. That second thing turns out to matter more. His acknowledgement, Setiya writes, was its own small consolation, a step toward writing this book. Not a cure, not even relief. Just one person in a white coat conceding that the storm outside the window was real. There is a famous claim that pain destroys language. Virginia Woolf wrote that English, which can express the thoughts of Hamlet, has no words for the shiver and the headache. Setiya thinks she is wrong, and he lets Hilary Mantel answer her. No one's pain is so special that the Devil's Dictionary of Anguish has not anticipated it. Singing aches, the drilling pain. What pain actually does is stranger. It drags the body into view. A healthy body is transparent. An organist playing Bach attends to the music, not to her fingers. Pain ends that arrangement. And the reverse gift never arrives, because the bliss of being pain-free evaporates the instant the pain stops. Attempting to dwell on the absence of pain, Setiya writes, is like turning on the lights to see the dark. Worse, chronic pain eats time. You can trade an hour of dental agony for years of sound teeth, and that arithmetic works inside a single life. It does not work across different people, and it stops working across a life long enough. The physician and philosopher Drew Letter puts it plainly. A painless past is all but forgotten. A painless future may be unimaginable. Emily Dickinson had already got there, around 1862. Pain has an element of blank. It cannot recollect when it begun, or if there were a time when it was not. So the tidy analogy between one long pain and many small ones collapses, and Setiya draws the conclusion that opens the rest of the book. Pain is lonely not just because it separates us from others, but because it separates us from ourselves. He was 7, locked out of school in the rain, and he wrote 4 rhyming lines about being out in this so desolate place. He remembers that childhood is solitary. He does not remember it as lonely. That distinction runs the entire chapter, because solitude is a circumstance and loneliness is a wound. Then, at the end of March 2020, an estimated 2.5 billion people, a third of the planet, entered lockdown at once. and the species got a crash course in the difference. Setiya's own response, he admits, was a cliché. He started a podcast, which is funny, and it is also the exact shape of the answer he arrives at 80 pages later, though it takes him most of the chapter to work out why it worked. First, he clears away the panic. Britain appointed a minister of loneliness in 2018. Publishers have been running alarmed books about our fraying bonds for 70 years, and the statistic everyone cites, that Americans were 3 times more likely to have nobody to confide in by 2004 than in 1985, turned out to be an artifact of the order the questions were asked in. When researchers flipped the order back in 2010, the number came out lower than 1985. Then Setiya inverts the history entirely. The historian Keith Thomas found that early modern friends were valued because they were useful. It was the market economy of all things that pried business apart from affection and made room for friendship chosen purely for pleasure. The invisible hand was first offered in friendship. That does not make loneliness harmless. Chronic isolation shows up in the body, and one influential summary places its health impact alongside high blood pressure, inactivity, obesity, and smoking. Brain imaging suggests social rejection lights up regions we associate with physical pain, though that inference is contested. Deprivation studies on infant primates and the state orphanages of Ceausescu's Romania point the same way. And then there's the deliberate version. Tocqueville, touring American prisons in 1833, concluded that solitary confinement does not reform it. It kills. 5 Mulem spent more than 2,000 days inside it, losing human contact, he said. You lose your sense of identity. You become nothing. I became invisible even to myself. But Setiya insists these are symptoms. They are not yet the harm itself. So what is the harm? One popular answer says other people are what make us who we are. Descartes shut himself in a stove-heated room in 1639 and tried to derive an entire world from a solitary mind. Hegel replied that there is no I without a you. Wittgenstein argued you could not even hold a private language. Grant every step of it. Setiya still says the inference fails, and he uses a painting to show why. Gwen John's portrait, The Convalescent, is moving. The blank canvas underneath the paint is not. A canvas is a necessary condition of the picture and inherits none of the picture's value. In the same way, other people can be the precondition of a self without that explaining why being without them hurts. The reason has to be simpler than that. Here it is. Aristotle gave 2 of the 10 books of his ethics to friendship, then ruined it with a condition. Only the good, he said, can truly be loved. Setiya answers that friendship is not a meritocracy because you are not your character. Being loved for yourself means being loved for something other than your earned qualities, or else love is a performance review that never ends. He will not even grant that friends should think well of us. No one, he notes, knows my faults better than my wife. What friendship recognizes is closer to what Kant called dignity, the thing that has no price and no substitute, which is why friendlessness cuts so deep. To be friendless is to feel oneself shrinking, disappearing from the human world. We are made for love, and we are lost without it. But if loneliness is a wound, its cruelty is that it makes you worse at healing it. Emily White's memoir maps the loop. You need people. Needing them is stressful, so you withdraw, which multiplies the need. The research agrees. The lonely turn hypervigilant for social threat and start misreading the room, though their actual social skills test fine, which makes the instruction counterintuitive. The hunger, one researcher wrote, is never satisfied by focusing on eating. You have to feed someone else. White ended up at a soup kitchen and a basketball league. Setiya started that podcast and found that people disclose something true within about 25 minutes if you genuinely listen. Friendship can begin with attention rather than common ground, which means opening yourself when what is opened is a wound. August 2012. The comedian Tig Notaro walks on stage in Los Angeles 4 days after a breast cancer diagnosis, 4 months after her mother died, and does a bit about the hospital's patient satisfaction questionnaire, considering, she says, that her mother had no brain activity. The room cannot decide whether it is allowed to laugh. That is grief's polyphony, and Setiya splits it into 3. There is grief for a relationship that has been broken. There is grief at the harm done to the person who died. And there is grief at the sheer loss of a life. They are not the same thing. and each says something different about what the love was, which is why the sports writer mourning a pitcher she never met is not confused. She has no roadmap, but she is not confused. And nearly everything we believe about the process is wrong. Freud's grief work, the notion that mourning is a job you complete, is unsupported. Being forced to debrief a trauma immediately afterward, the studies show, can do harm that lasts for years. And there is no evidence that grief arrives in 5 neat stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. That model was built around the terminally ill facing their own deaths, not around the bereaved. What the data shows instead is waves. Grief oscillates, and it is survivable only because it oscillates. Fittingly, the books that got it right abandoned structure. Barthes has wrote his mourning diary on quartered slips of typing paper. B.S. Johnson published a novel in 1969 as 27 loose booklets in a box, readable in any order except the first and the last. Which brings Setiya to the fight at the center of the book. Epicurus offers the ancient world's most famous consolation. When you kiss your child, remind yourself that it is a human being you are kissing, and then, if one of them should die, you will not be upset. Good to know, Setiya replies. His objection is not that this is cold, it is that it is sour grapes dressed as wisdom, and that it smuggles in a theodicy, working only if the cosmos is running to some benevolent plan. Henry James saw the price of it in 1868, imagining that same serenity practiced comfortably in the slave-holding American South. Setiya's hammer is a line of Virginia Woolf's. Never pretend that the things you have not got are not worth having. He tests it on the smallest grief he owns. He was 15, and a girl named Jules ended it. Kissing had been strictly rationed. He responded by phoning her repeatedly, demanding an explanation she did not owe him. The cure, when it arrived, was not philosophical. It was making out with her best friend at a party he can no longer remember. It is a comic story, and he tells it to make a serious point. Nothing had been harmed except a relationship. Nobody had died. And Iris Murdoch's line explains why that was enough to level him. You die at heart from a withdrawal of love. Romantic grief mourns the thing that existed between two people, not the other person, who is still walking around out there. It mourns the us. When someone does die, though, what exactly is lost? Samuel Scheffler offers a vocabulary. Some relationships are completed and some are archived, still real, no longer running. Julian Barnes insists on it. The fact that someone is dead may mean that they are not alive, but does not mean that they do not exist. I talk to her constantly. C.S. Lewis went further, calling bereavement as normal a sequel to marriage as marriage is to courtship, or autumn to summer. Not the interruption of the dance, but the next figure, which leaves Epicurus, who called death nothing to us, since we will not be there for it. Setiya calls that sophistry. You do not have to exist in order to miss out. And what we mourn in a death at 90, where nothing ordinary was missed, is the bare fact of oblivion. Then comes the grief he cannot archive, because it is not finished. A summer in the Cotswolds, and his mother begins repeating other people's words as if they arrived unbidden. England's green and pleasant land. The diagnosis follows 12 months later. His father, once a doctor, becomes her full-time carer. Setiya reads Annie Ernaux's account of her own mother's decline as a forecast of his own, and finds inside it a sentence he recognizes with horror. Right now, I would like her to be dead and free of such degradation. He does not soften that. He does not explain it away or apologize for it. He sets beside it the only thing he is certain of, which is not consolation and is not a cure. If we did not grieve, we would not love. Here is the puzzle that follows. If the reason for grief is permanent, since she is still gone tomorrow, why does the grief fade? More than half of those who lose a partner or a child are, in one leading researcher's data, recovering within a few months. Barthes asked the guilty version out loud. Does being able to live without someone you loved mean you loved her less than you thought? Setiya's answer is that the category is wrong. Grief is not a state you sit inside, like a temperature. It is something you do, over time, and things we do have beginnings and middles and ends. The same is true of love, which means grief's waning will always look unintelligible from the inside. And that is precisely why every culture invented rituals. At the funeral of a philosopher of physics, dead of cancer at 38, A note was read aloud expressing the man's impish delight at having forced his atheist colleagues into a religious ceremony, and the community closed around his family. That is the function. Cultures build these machines everywhere. 7 days of Shiva. Paper replicas burned in China. A Roman law rationing mourning by the month. Then the First World War broke Western mourning, and nobody rebuilt it. When Setiya married, no officiant would give him the liturgy without the God he does not believe in. And when his father-in-law died suddenly in January 2021, the family sat Shiva over video and improvised, watching his team lose, buying a losing lottery ticket on his birthday. If life is a story, grief reminds us. It does not have a happy ending. Perhaps it is not a story. Baseball keeps a hall of failure. Merkel's boner in 1908. The Snodgrass muff in 1912. Bill Buckner in 1986. And above all, Ralph Branca, who threw the pitch that became the shot heard round the world in 1951 and wore it for the rest of his life. Setiya's own entry is smaller. He failed his driving test twice, once without escaping the parking lot, while his wife sat beside him 9 months pregnant. The only reason he could legally drive her to the hospital being that she was in the car. But the book he reaches for is Joshua Prager's account of that 1951 pitch, which refuses to build toward it. It halts the season for a fifth of its length, pauses mid-throw to describe what each man ate for breakfast, and scrambles its own sentences to defeat what Prager calls the inertia of retrospection. Why does that matter? Because the same trick gets played on whole lives. In 1649, weeks after Charles I was executed, a man named Gerard Winstanley declared the earth a common treasury for all and led a group of poor men onto St. George's Hill to dig it. The landowners sued. Then they burned the houses down. A possible future died on that hill, and by every visible measure, Winstanley failed. But in 1650, with the settlement collapsing around him, he wrote 7 words about it. I have writ, I have acted, I have peace. Historians describe him as exhausted and bitterly disillusioned, and both things are true at once. What Setiya takes from him is the seed of the chapter, that there is dignity in protest, and that protest belongs to a category of action we barely have words for. The doctrine under attack has a name: life as narrative. Oliver Sacks, Jerome Bruner, Alasdair MacIntyre, Charles Taylor, and Daniel Dennett, who called us all virtuoso novelists, agree that a self is a story it tells about itself. Galen Strawson calls this a fallacy of our age and reports that he simply has no sense of his life as a narrative. There is an irony Setiya cannot resist, since Galen's father, P.F. Strawson, spent a career defending very nearly what his son attacks. But the real evidence is Iris Murdoch. Classics, then the civil service, then a decade as a philosopher, then 26 novels in 41 years, a chaotic private life, and, as her biographer puts it, plenty of hurt feelings. No arc. The novels got longer, not better. Her best was her first. She lived well anyway. The novelist Jane Allison noticed how narrow our idea of a story has become. For centuries, there has been one approved path. A situation arises, grows tense, reaches a peak, subsides. Bit masculosexual, she says. No? Stories can also meander, spiral, branch, divide like cells. Nicholson Baker wrote an entire novel about a single escalator ride, footnotes running for pages, going precisely nowhere, and going there beautifully. Setiya's conclusion is the sharpest sentence in the chapter. It is by squeezing your life into a single tube that you set yourself up for definitive failure. Failure, in the modern sense, is not an event that happens to you. It is an identity you agree to accept. So do not let the lure of the dramatic arc distract you from the digressive amplitude of being alive. None of which tells you what to do instead. Setiya once wrote a newspaper column about living in the present, and the comments section filled with furious Buddhists, livid that he had cited Aristotle rather than them. If Buddhism, for you, means leaving irate comments on opinion articles, he replies, you may be doing it wrong. The Bhagavad Gita said it earlier, motive should never be in the fruits of action, nor should you cling to inaction. And Dostoevsky wrote it into a novel with no plan at all, sending off the idiot chapter by chapter, forgetting powers he had given his hero, letting his narrator give up. Inside it, a dying young man says the thing the whole chapter has been circling. Columbus was happy not when he had discovered America, but while he was discovering it. That is the distinction. and it comes from Aristotle. Some activities aim at an endpoint and are finished by reaching it. Building a house, getting the promotion, finishing the book. Aristotle called these motions, and philosophers now call them telic. Others have no endpoint built in. Walking, parenting, listening to music, being a friend. Those are atelic, and they cannot be completed because there is nothing to complete. Here is why it matters. The satisfaction of a telic project is always in the future or already in the past, never in the room with you. So every goal you pursue is, in a real sense, an attempt to destroy a source of meaning in your life. Aristotle's version is better. Someone who is living well has, at the same time, lived well, which is what Groundhog Day is actually about. Phil Connors, trapped in one repeating day, moves through confusion, recklessness, mania, and despair, and finally becomes serene by learning piano, French, ice sculpture, card throwing, none of which he can ever finish anything with. The most careful fan estimate puts him in there just under 34 years. Setiya rejects the Buddhist reading of it. Valuing the atelic is not detachment from the present, it is attachment to the present. Not emptiness, but fullness. And then he does the hardest thing in the book, which is to admit the argument did not save him. 2 decades of striving had turned philosophy into a queue of projects, and he had lost the love of simply doing it. In his last book, he prescribed meditation. He still believes in it. It was not enough. Because the pressure is not only in his head. The historian Scott Sandage traced the word failure back to the middle of the 19th century, when it stopped describing a business and started describing a person, arriving alongside the invention of the credit report, which calibrated identity in the language of commodity. Emerson supplied the theology in 1860. There is always a reason in the man for his good or bad fortune. Andrew Carnegie supplied the gospel. And 30 years before Carnegie, Frederick Douglass gave the speech the whole tradition still quotes, hammering the same note 4 times over. We may explain success mainly by one word, and that word is work. Work, work, work. Which is the most useful sentence in the chapter, and also, as we are about to see, not the whole of what Douglass said. The cost of believing it is measurable. Emerson, writing during the crash of 1837, put it in 5 words: the land stinks with suicide. The economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton have documented American life expectancy falling since 2015, driven by what they call deaths of despair. And their explanation is not primarily economic. It is what happens when people are taught to see themselves, rather than the society around them, as the failure. And here is Douglass again in the same speech. In the paragraph, nobody quotes. Properly speaking, there are in the world no such men as self-made men. We have all either begged, borrowed, or stolen. He knew the myth was false. He preached it anyway, because knowing a myth is false does not remove its power. With failure, Setiya writes, the personal is political. Late 2020, and Setiya is scrolling the headlines. Unemployment, foreclosures, political gridlock, threats of insurrection, a black man shot by police, a glacier melting so fast the scientists watching it are stunned. My heart begins to race with horror and panic. So the chapter opens on the oldest challenge in ethics, from Plato's Republic, where Glaucon describes a shepherd who finds a ring that makes him invisible and uses it to seduce a queen and murder a king. Why be just if you could get away with anything? Setiya thinks the question is a conjuring trick, and he borrows Wittgenstein's line about the decisive move in a trick being the one that looked innocent. Sets self-interest against morality without ever saying what self-interest is, and you have already rigged the answer. Instead, he offers a life. Simone Weil, born in Paris in 1909, gave up chocolate before she was 10 because soldiers at the front were denied sweets. She gave her teaching salary to workers. She refused to heat her apartment beyond what the unemployed could afford. She picked grapes for 8 hours a day, and when too exhausted to stand, picked them lying down. In London in 1943, she ate only what the ration allowed in occupied France and died of starvation and tuberculosis at 34. What a beautiful room in which to die, she said of the place. Her nicknames included the categorical imperative in skirts, and Setiya is honest about the effect she has on him. She is inspiring, and she is terrifying. and you cannot argue anyone into becoming her. So the question changes. Not how do we prove to the egomaniac that he should care, because Plato tried that and Kant tried that, and the proofs do not work. A man tempted to keep a deposit, Weil observed, is not going to be stopped by reading Kant. The question is, what makes anyone see another person in the first place? Weil called it reading. Murdoch dramatized it. A mother works patiently against her own prejudice toward her daughter-in-law until the woman she dismissed as vulgar becomes refreshingly simple, and the one she called juvenile becomes delightfully youthful. Nothing changed except attention. Love, Murdoch wrote, is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. The enemy she names is the fat, relentless ego. This is the window, and the storm, and the work of looking through it. That reframes the whole business of political philosophy. The dominant method builds an ideal and measures reality against it. Plato designed a perfect city with castes and no families. Rawls modeled a realistic utopia in which everyone complies. Setiya's objection is that we have never needed a blueprint to recognize dispossession, chattel slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, mass imprisonment, police violence, voter suppression. Utopia, he notes dryly, does not see race. Adorno went further still, refusing to describe the emancipated future at all, because ideology distorts what we can even imagine as possible. There is tenderness, he wrote, only in the coarsest demand that no one shall go hungry anymore. You do not need a picture of paradise. You need to notice who is hungry. The political theorist Iris Marion Young named the hard part, not the injustice that comes from someone's prejudiced act, but the kind that emerges from ordinary people following ordinary rules. Her example is the unpaid care work that quietly lands on women. Her model of responsibility is not about blame, but about change, and Setiya turns it on himself without flinching. He bought a house in Brookline partly for the excellent public schools, in a country where the median white family holds around $188,000 of wealth and the median black family around $24,000. She is looking at me, he writes. Young admitted the scale of it is paralyzing. Setiya's answer is deliberately small. Do not try to fix everything. Pick a single issue, find a group you can join, and do one thing. Because the arithmetic is otherwise unbearable. The Earth is about 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than 1850, and on pace for 2 degrees within 30 years, at which point roughly 1 million people in Bangladesh are permanently displaced and Central Africa loses 1/10 to 1/5 of its rainfall. Since 1990, the United States and Europe have produced more than a quarter of emissions, China 15%. America emits nearly 12% with under 5% of the world's people. Per person, sub-Saharan Africa emits 1/20 of what Americans do. Setiya notes that the idea of a personal carbon footprint was aggressively promoted by an oil company. In 2014, he helped run 4 miles of blue tape across the MIT campus, marking where a 5-foot storm surge would reach in 2050. That campaign mostly lost. The committee voted to divest from coal and tar sands and unanimously for an ethics council, and the Institute's climate plan ignored its own committee. There would be no divestment and no ethics. A 4-month sit-in won partial concessions, which raises the specter of Adorno, who fled Frankfurt for California, wrote his greatest work in exile, returned, and in 1968 called the police on his own students. A critic said he had taken up residence in a beautiful hotel on the edge of an abyss. And Adorno's most quoted line is the one Setiya has to face. Wrong life cannot be lived rightly. We know we have limits, he answers, but we do not know where they are. So it would be an awfully neat coincidence if we happen to be doing enough. Our guilt is not a mistake. But guilt is not a program. If the only thing worth doing were reducing suffering, there would eventually be no point to a life at all, because you would have nothing left to protect. So Setiya defends what he calls existential value, art, pure science, theoretical philosophy. And the philosopher Zena hits his list of little human things, which is better. Funny stories, amateur painting, swimming, carpentry, games. There's a scene he keeps returning to. 2 young women in a Sorbonne courtyard. Simone Weil says nothing matters except the revolution that will feed everyone. Simone de Beauvoir says we should also care about the meaning of life. Weil looks at her and says, "It is clear you have never gone hungry." Weil had the final word. Setiya writes. Beauvoir was right. He was 7 or 8, standing near the tree trunks at recess, and he was stunned by the fact that there was anything at all. He recognizes it now as the sensation Sartre wrote a novel about, whose narrator is also undone by a tree. Why is there something rather than nothing? Leibniz asked it first. The philosopher Sidney Morgenbesser gave the best answer anyone has given. If there were nothing, you would still complain. Then comes the move everyone has seen, the blue marble. A galaxy of 100 billion stars, one of billions. Deep time. The absurdity of life, Setiya concedes, has become a cliché, which is exactly why the chapter is dangerous, because he is not going to leave it there. He flags it early, almost casually. The meaning of life is in this chapter. First, he separates two questions people constantly merge. Meaning in life is about what makes a particular life worth living, and Susan Wolf has written well about it. Meaning of life is a claim about the whole thing, and that is the one Tolstoy went silent under when he wrote that his life came to a standstill. Nihilism cannot be refuted on its own terms, Setiya admits. What illuminates the world with value in the first place is not an argument. It is a tension. And meaning is not the same as function. Thomas Nagel proved it in one sentence in 1971. If we learned that we were being raised as food for other creatures fond of human flesh, that would still not give our lives meaning. Chickens do not share in the glory of a good meal. Here's the fact that should be better known. The phrase, the meaning of life, is not ancient. It does not appear in Plato, Aristotle, Seneca, Epicurus, Augustine, Aquinas, Descartes, Hume, or Kant. It was coined in 1834 in a novel by Thomas Carlyle in the mouth of a fictional German philosopher whose name translates roughly as devil's dung, in a chapter called The Everlasting No, describing a universe as one huge, dead, immeasurable steam engine rolling on in dead indifference. So what would an answer even look like? Setiya says it works like the meaning of a painting, not its purpose, but what it is about, in a way that tells you how to feel. The meaning of life would be a truth about us and the world that answers that question and tells us what to feel and why. Which is why he thinks any real answer is a religion, whether or not it has a God, because it claims a truth beyond the visible. Meditation for calm is not a religion. Therapy is not a religion. Neither discovers that kind of truth. The trouble is, the traditional answers are theodicies in fancy dress. Alexander Pope, whatever is right. Leibniz, the best of all possible worlds. Hegel, the real world is as it ought to be. And William James pointed out the flaw. There is no rationally deducible connection between any outer fact and the sentiment it happens to provoke. Democritus laughed at the universe. Heraclitus wept at it. The mathematician Frank Ramsey, dead at 26, chose his response deliberately. The stars may be large, but they cannot think or love. And Camus named what is left. We ask, and the universe shrugs. So Setiya changes the subject in a way that is not a dodge. Imagine, as P.D. James did, a world where no child has been conceived for 18 years. Everyone alive is fine. Everyone alive stops caring. The philosopher Samuel Scheffler calls this the collective afterlife, and the point is brutal. Almost everything we do daily is mortgaged to an unspoken faith that humanity outlives us. The obvious objection is a 9-year-old in a Woody Allen film who will not do his homework because the universe is expanding. If value depends on posterity, the last generation does nothing worthwhile, and neither does the one before, all the way back to us. But the dominoes only fall if the first one does, and it does not. Grief at extinction. Setiya says, is ecological grief turned back on ourselves? Humanity is lovable too. And that is the answer. Not survival on its own, because mere survival is not enough. We have unfinished business, and the list is specific. Injustice, ignorance, untapped creativity, inhibited love. If humanity worked toward justice and then met its end with grace, Setiya writes, he would be okay with that. What would be unbearable is history ending with our potential unrealized. The afterlife it calls for is collective. The meaning of life would lie in our halting, perhaps perpetual progress toward justice in this world. Note the word halting. Hegel thought history had a fixed direction, Marx thought so too. Setiya does not. The arc of the moral universe depends on what we do, and that depends on us. Walter Benjamin left a note guessing that revolutions are not the locomotive of history, but the passengers reaching for the emergency brake, which leaves hope. And hope is not what you think. Diogenes the cynic, who lived in a storage jar and once threw a plucked chicken into Plato's lecture hall, shouting, "Here is Plato's man," was asked what is most precious in life. He said hope. But go back further to Hesiod in the 8th century before Christ. And hope is inside Pandora's jar of evils, and the lid slams shut before it can escape. Is our curse that we have hope, or that we do not? The myth refuses to say. Setiya's therapist tells him his resistance to hope is proof of its significance, and what he needs is courage. Hope, he concludes, is and ought to be an object of ambivalence. It is desire, plus a live possibility, plus a concession to everything you cannot control. Rebecca Solnit disagrees magnificently. Hope, she writes, is not a lottery ticket you sit on the sofa clutching. Hope should shove you out the door. Setiya's reply is that it can be a lottery ticket, and it need not shove you anywhere, because by itself, hope does absolutely nothing. Watching election returns with agonized hope is not a virtue, it is an ordeal. When things turn out badly, hope is more harrowing than despair. What actually moves people is underneath it. Patrice Cullors described Black Lives Matter as rooted in grief and rage, but pointed toward vision and dreams. Greta Thunberg told Davos she did not want them hopeful. She wanted them to panic. Hope does not inspire us to act. It makes room for grief and rage to do that. It is the temperature at which iron can be worked. So, what may we hope for? Not the ideal life, which was never on the table. Not survival past death either. Setiya takes the technologist's dream apart in 2 moves. If your brain is not erased, the machine is a duplicate. If it is switched on when you die, it is still a duplicate. You do not go on, you are merely copied. What remains is other people. To paraphrase Kafka, there is plenty of hope, no end of hope, only not for us. Who are we? Not just the living, but humankind. Climate hope, he says, comes quite literally by degrees, and when you can no longer hope for 2, you hope for 2.5. He can hope to walk with his mother by the estuary again. He knows she will not recover. Both are true. Setiya ends by listing what to put down: the best life as a target, happiness as the human good, self-interest as separable from the good of others. Love need not be earned. Grief is no mistake. Then he goes to a play. Heaney's version of Philoctetes, the soldier abandoned on an island with a rotting wound, alone with nothing but the beat of the waves and the beat of my raw wound, until the man sent to trick him confesses instead. Heaney gave the chorus the most quoted lines in modern Irish poetry about the longed-for tidal wave of justice when hope and history rhyme. Setiya, at the last, refuses that comfort. The poet knows as well as we do that hope and history do not rhyme. But one day, in some undreamt-of harmony, they might. That is the whole offer. Not a window closed against the storm, but somebody out in it beside you, admitting they hear the wind.